Despite some lackluster seasons when it comes to challenging in the playoffs, the Miami Dolphins always remained fantasy relevant with so many key pieces of interest for our redraft leagues. So, Ed, we are ready to go through an exciting roster, one that's had a little bit of change and one that has a fantasy star of old that we're still not quite sure if he is happy, if he's staying, or what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, they come off from a fantasy perspective and maybe a season perspective, a bit of a nightmare 2024 to the Dolphins, and they'll look to put that in the rearview mirror very much and get back on track. So, as always, we'll start off with quarterback with Tua Tagovailoa. A very solid quarterback. Injuries impacted Tua last season. He lost 4 weeks to concussion. But came back well after that, only to miss the last couple of weeks to a late season knee injury. We're looking at someone who was QB 22 last year, but was QB 9 in 2023 when Hill had one of those mega seasons. He was solid in between the injuries last season and put up some decent numbers behind, let's be fair to him, a very, very poor O-line. And that O-line hasn't really been addressed in the offseason, which would still worry me. Weeks 11 to 14 were when he was at his best. He racked up 4 scores of 20 or more and 4 top 10 finishes. And that's what he has in his locker with his talent and with the talent around him. He's an excellent passer. He's got those weapons, but I don't think he's going to be in that top 10 quarterback conversation this year. And he's not going to be on my fantasy radar. I think mostly because that O-line does worry me. It is very porous, to say the least.
I think he's one that in a Superflex redraft league would be in consideration for your QB2, depending on your strategy. I think in single QB, I think we both shy away from drafting backup quarterbacks in single QB redraft, but he's one that I would imagine will be rostered in most places. But it's when do you start him? Other than the bye weeks, I wouldn't be overly confident starting him in above the players I would likely have already if he's there. And that's where that drafting your backup QB comes in, isn't it? If you're never going to start them, other than the bye, you may as well not bother. And that's why I think his roster percentage will probably still be around 85, 90%, you'd have thought anyway. But yeah, I don't know when I would start him with confidence for the reasons you've said.
There is a world where he gets into the groove as to the rest of the offense, and he has a 2023 style season. But I think that projection of 15 is very generous. I think he'll probably finish in the low teens, early 20s, to be honest, unless anything dramatic happens.
Tua is a player that we've kind of been waiting to, over the last couple of years, waiting to kind of come up and really kick on and get those numbers that we think we could see from him. When we move to running back, we've got a player that a portion of the online fantasy community seem to be taking great glee in the fact they've predicted downfall at some point. Where do you stand on Devon Achane?
I rate Devon Achane. I mean, last year he put up huge numbers. Basically, at times last year, he was the Dolphins' offense. He got through a huge workload, and understandably, that affected his explosiveness. He had 7.8 yards per carry in 2023, and that dropped right off to 4.5 yards last year. But I get that. But he had 11 RB1 weeks, hugely outperforming his ADP. He was involved in the receiving game too. He got 6 receiving touchdowns alongside 6 rushing touchdowns. I think the big question this year is, are the Dolphins going to overwork him again? Because I think they did last year. Or are the other weapons going to step up to the mark and take back some of that workload from Achane? He was RB5 last year. And he's going off the board similar this year, RB5, RB6. Maybe that's a little bit too high for me. Remember, in his rookie year, he was RB24 with a couple of enormous weeks. But yeah, I think Achane will be reliable once again in fantasy.
I think where he's going in redraft at the minute is towards the end of the top tier running backs, which is still towards the middle and top of the top tier wide receiver options. And that's why I don't think I'm going to end up drafting much of him. It's because the wide receivers going around the same point, I think, represent a safer ceiling than Achane. Definitely a case to be made for him. I think people are still worried about the size. People are still worried about injuries and all of this. But the biggest tick in the box for Achane is that finally Raheem Mostert is out of the way and he's not got to contend with him stealing work. And behind him, there's no one really to be worried about with one potential year two back. We'd like to see more from, but I'm not a huge optimistic. I'm interested to hear your take on the rest of the depth chart.
No, well, you've got, as you can see, Mattison and Jaylen Wright. I don't think either will be a threat to Achane, but there might be a threat to each other in terms of RB2. Wright did absolutely nothing in his rookie year. Whilst Mattison ended up as RB32, he had 6 weeks scoring 10 or more fancy points. So he did a decent job as a backup running back. Seems destined to be that. We wanted that post-Dalvin Cook breakout for Mattison, but it never happened, did it? I mean, it's hard to criticise Mattison for not performing the previous season in that dysfunctional Raiders offense, I suppose. But yeah, if I was going to go for either of them, I'd go for Mattison just because we've got nothing to go on with Wright. He might have a lot of talent and he might be talked up, but he did nothing last year. So it's difficult to make a case for him.
Before we move on to wide receiver, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and give us a share as well. Whilst you're on the channel, why not check out one of the other of our 32 NFL team deep dive shows with a redraft focus and some dynasty content on the site as well, if you'd like to take a look at that. But Ed, before we move on, I think the player we're about to talk about is no stranger to a cryptic post on social media, no stranger to making his demands known. So I'd like to point out we are recording on the 6th of July 2025 as we move on to a player who's volatile enough that he could be on a different team by the time you watch this later in the off-season.
I've made no Dolphins wide receiver notes. Is there anyone to talk about?
Oh, have you heard of a...
sorry. I did. I did make.
He's very low profile. Very low profile. You may not have seen much of him.
Under the radar, like a la Aaron Rodgers, isn't he? I mean, Tyreek Hill, there's a lot we could say about him. It absolutely fell apart for the fantasy superstar last year. He would argue, with some justification, that he played through a wrist injury all season. And he threw his toys out the pram at the end of the season. But at the moment, at time of recording, he is still in Miami and has had an operation on that wrist injury in the off-season. So he will look to bounce back wherever he ends up. Will he return to his pre-2024 numbers, which, let's remind you, in his first 2 years in Miami, he got over 1,700 yards per season? The answer is almost certainly no. But he hasn't become an also-ran overnight. I think wide receiver 12-13 is pretty much spot on, although that number is still slightly inflated by his previous production and his name value. For me, he's a solid wide receiver 2 this season, and I'd be very happy to have him in that spot in my team. Wherever he ends up, I think he will get the targets, he will get the numbers, hopefully with that wrist injury resolved. So regardless of where he ends up after that kind of really disappointing season last season, I do think there'll be some sort of bounce back from Hill this year, but not to the kind of wide receiver 1-2 numbers of the years that preceded it.
I think the appeal is when you're looking at the wide receivers going around him. So you've got McConkey, JSN, T. Higgins, Garrett Wilson. A case could be made for any one of those over Tyreek Hill. The big kind of plus for Tyreek Hill is that we have seen him do superstar things, and that sits in the back of my mind that could we have some games like that. But he's also going into he's also 31 now going into the season. So when his whole thing has been faster, stronger, than other players. Age is there against him now, and that's also going to feed into it. Do you think we'll see a changing of the guard of more kind of solid in its nature this year with Jaylen Waddle taking the mantle from Hill, or is it going to be a split, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, Jaylen Waddle has had a horrible 2 seasons. Absolutely horrible 2 seasons. Wide receiver 34 in 2023, wide receiver 46 last year. It was supposed to be a bounce back season for him last year, but he had the worst season of his career, just 58 receptions and 2 touchdowns. Let's remember he was the number 6 overall pick when he was drafted in 2021. Drafted, I think, in T. Higgins' year, wasn't he? He was in that class. And, you know, many people touted him as the talent of that class. Last year, he was outshone by Hill, but also Achane and Jonnu Smith in the receiving game. Is there a world where Waddle has a better season? Of course there is. We can't really do much worse. I don't really see a route to him being hugely fantasy relevant beyond maybe a few decent flex weeks, which would be an upgrade on last season, to be fair. So, yeah, I mean, wide receiver 24 is what you're projecting, and wide receiver 32 is what he's going off the board. I think that's the best you can hope for. Late 20s, early 30s. He's not going to be a wide receiver 1. I don't think he'll supplant Hill as wide receiver 1. If Hill moved on, might that force Waddle to maybe up his game potentially? I've kind of lost faith in Waddle after a couple of horrific seasons.
And when we're looking at him being wide receiver 24, I'm not saying he's going to be a bottom end wide receiver 2 on your roster every single week. If you're ending up with the season as wide receiver 24, you might have 1 or 2 top 12 weeks scattering between 12 and 24, but that will include the odd week where you are outside the top 50, top 60 even potentially as well. It's what we've seen from him before. Similar when we looked at Tyreek Hill and the players going around and what that meant for your choices, that wide receiver 30 to 34 region where Waddle's going, there's huge question marks around every player there. So Travis Hunter at ADP 30, how often is he going to be catching the ball? How often is he going to be trying to intercept the ball? Chris Olave, question mark after question mark. Jordan Addison, once again, competing for targets against the elite Just Jefferson and likely to miss time because of his DUI issues. And Chris Godwin, we're not quite sure if he's going to be ready for week 1 or not. It's a muddy part of the wide receiver ADP, isn't it? And that's why Waddle is sat in that mix.
Yeah, and 'twas ever thus. That's that. If you're in that region, you're not going to get any guarantees, are you? And could Waddle have a better season? Yeah, he could, and it could pay off if you drafted him. He's certainly got the talent, but there's definitely no guarantees there.
Who is following up behind him that are giving him any cause for concern for his snap share?
Couple of wide receivers to keep an eye on. You've got Malik Washington. Quiet rookie season, but he came on strong at the end. He's shown he's got the talent to emerge as the number 3 receiver. But they have also signed Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, which might harm that value of Washington. Coming off the best of his fantasy seasons in 2024, surely 9 touchdowns is an outlier, though. And I'd be surprised if he matches those numbers in 2025. So both will get reps. Both undoubtedly will have fantasy relevant weeks, but in terms of fantasy options, I think, both will end up being also Rams.
Yeah, I can't imagine we'll be talking much about Washington or Westbrook-Ikhine in season when it comes to fantasy. And if Hill does move on, I think it's more likely that someone will come back the other way that reiterates that we're not going to be talking about Washington or Westbrook-Ikhine through the season. We were due to record this a week ago. We were due to talk about Jonnu Smith a week ago, but there's been a bit of a surprise move in old Miami, which means we are now, Ed, going to talk about a player we didn't think we'd talk about ever again on the show, Mr.
Yes,
Darren Waller.
He has come out of retirement, as you can see. That's Darren Waller, who had obviously retired last year, but in the previous 3 seasons, any production he put up was kind of ruined and affected by injuries. So he's very much a wild card when it comes to the fantasy season that's upcoming. In 2019, 2020, he was an absolute fantasy machine, top tier tight end, putting up mega scores. But then everything went wrong, really, with injuries and whatnot. But if you look, I've got the list of tight ends here in Miami. Forgive me because I'll have to read them because I don't know any of them. So apart from Wally, you've got Julian Hill, Pharaoh Brown, Hayden Rucci, Jalen Conyers, and Tanner Connor. So I think he's not going to have much competition at the position. So a fit and firing Darren Waller could be a bit of a steal. We'll wait and see what happens. But he could also be absolutely knackered and hardly play any games. We just don't know, do we?
No, and he's 32, which in the grand scheme of it for a tight end isn't tremendously old. That year off could well have helped him to be repaired and fighting fit and good to go again. That year off could also mean he's lost a step when it comes to actual game speed play. I've put wait and see because I am not going to draft him anywhere in redraft. There is never a point I'm going to want to pick him up and use a bench spot on him. However, best ball, there'll be a price point that I'll take the gamble on him. When it comes to looking to put him on my bench in Dynasty, I have done in 1 or 2 places where I've got a bench space to burn to see what happens. I think also it might be an interesting tight end matchup friendly play for DFS at times. But we could also say very little about him and he might appear on our zero section week in, week out next year as well. I have no idea. And when I've got no idea at all, I don't make a case to myself to draft them and redraft in any situation.
I wonder whether, are the Dolphins going to put all their tight end eggs into a Darren Waller shaped basket, or might they draft someone else? Might they get someone else to play alongside him? I don't know. I suppose we have to wait and see. But it's interesting. It's an interesting pickup, that's for sure.
I think at that point it's also worth reminding again, we are recording on the 6th of July, so if anything has changed since we cannot predict the future, we do apologise. We will work on that for our fantasy content in the future because that'd be very, very useful. Before we move on then and close the show, Ed, what are you expecting for the Dolphins this year?
Not much. I think, it depends what happens with Hill. Not that I think he's the key to anything, but as I mentioned, they've got some issues at O-line, some issues on defense. I think they'll end up with a solid number of wins, 7, 8, 9, but I don't see them making the playoffs.
No, I probably agree with that as well. Achane is obviously the absolute elite fantasy prospect on there, and he's going to have to get a lot of work done. That's the one thing that makes me lean towards Achane. Again, we're having that conversation that if points are going to happen, they're quite likely to come through the ground. They're quite likely to go through Achane, aren't they? That brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Miami Dolphins, though. So please do go and check out some of our other shows on each of the other teams in our deep dive series, and keep an eye on the show for the rest of the off-season as well. Whilst you're here, please do subscribe, a like, share, even stick a comment down below. Let us know any players that you think we are too high or too low on, or if you think we've done an excellent job and given you all the correct answers. But for now, it's goodbye from me, it's goodbye from Ed, and time for Malcolm to take us home.
You have been listening to Pestle and Ed of TH Fantasy Football. For more content, follow TH_fantasy_NFL on Instagram and Twitter.